Thanks for tuning in to the 55 Coop DeVille channel. Here's a video montage of our chicken coop build. We get extremely high winds in our area being up against the mountains, so I started out with 12-inch diameter, 24-inch deep holes that I dug out with a post hole digger. And then what you're seeing here with that cardboard deal, it's called sonotube or quick tube, and that allows you to leave a finished top to keep the snow and rain and moisture off of the supports so that they would hopefully resist rotting. Keeping with the theme of overbuilt chicken coops, I built the floor pretty beefy so I could have the option to do a sand floor on the inside if I wanted to, and that worked out pretty well. Again, using galvanized nails appropriate to the building code. And because of the cost of building materials are so high right now, I made sure I used each sheet good to its best of its ability. So I kept this a couple inches shorter and narrower than a standard 4x8 sheet of plywood so that I could easily cover it in the event that it ended up not being perfectly plumb level and square, which turned out pretty good. I ended up cutting it in half so it's easier to get in and wedge down in there. It went pretty well. Because there'd be chickens in this and I'd be crawling in and out of it, I took the time to draw out and chalk line or draw with a pencil where all the studs were so that I could perfectly hit every nail or every screw onto the studs and didn't have a shank sticking out to catch a forehead on or a chicken on. I also used ring shank nails for any sort of flooring or roof sheathing attachment, which is what the code would specify. It's common for people to build these out of screws, but the screws actually aren't as strong and don't have as high of a shear rating. So I use the appropriate specified code building materials at each step of this process because we do have extremely high winds and possible snow loads in our area. I wanted this coop to really withstand the weather and the elements for time, and so I got some heavy-duty Kills primer to cover everything. And one thing I didn't think of at all, honestly, was that it actually offers no water protection. So I was trying to prime everything ahead as I was building it so it'd paint really easily. And it did rain during this build as I was approaching winter, and it did, definitely negatively impact the floor quite a bit. So that was just something to think about. Use the correct paint materials. We regularly get winds 40 to 60 miles an hour coming off that big old mountain, so I followed building codes from hurricane zones when building this roof. So those are 2x6 roof joists. I have a 4x4 going across, so this is kind of a weird blend between a patio cover and a standard wood stud wall, which did pose its problems, but I was able to work it out. This was the first roof I've ever built, even though I am a licensed contractor and have built things. But I was able to work it out. This is a 3 and 12 pitch roof, which is the lowest slope that a traditional asphalt tile will work with and properly shed the water, which is important. I used hurricane ties. The appropriate nails specified by the specific hurricane tie is really important. And cutting the little bird's mouth and all that stuff was fairly intimidating in the beginning, but by the time I was done with this, it was pretty easy. And I like the single pitch roof because in the summer when it might be over 100 degrees, the hot air is going to more naturally leave out the top. So I am happy with it overall, even though it did get fairly awkward here and there. I went with a traditional asphalt tile roof and purchased the cheapest asphalt tiles they had at the hardware store. I did do a double layer of the asphalt underlayment and found a pretty cool video from this old house on how to lay it out. I've honestly never done a roof before, and I took the time to snap the chalk lines every 5 inches and cut them appropriately, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. It turned out perfectly straight and looks really attractive. I also spent the extra couple bucks for the little metal piece to shed the water off so that the wood doesn't rot underneath the roof. Before I started building, I sat down and hand drew everything out meticulously to make sure I didn't waste any materials because they're so pricey right now. So each side took 1.5 pieces of plywood, so I incorporated that into my height. So on the low end, it's got 4 foot, and on the high end there, it's got 6 foot of clearance. So you can see that I'm just under 8 foot, so I was able to attach the piece of plywood and trim it off flush with the 4x4s. Again, chalk lining out every stud so that I don't have any screws sticking in catching chicken heads. Building the little chicken hutch probably took the most brain power, and I found it easier to actually just draw it out. So I started out by drawing the dimensions I know, and then working backwards to find out the various angles and the specific lengths of each of the parts. And then once I started cutting them out, I put them back on the plywood to the jig and clamped them down to make sure that I was maintaining the original intention and dimensions of the activity. And it honestly worked out pretty good. If I did it again, I'd probably change it, to be honest, but it worked. And here's my wife doing the painting as I'm building so that everything is extremely protected and keeping the other animals involved. The dog figured out this was not for him and he did start to get jealous, and so we had to include him when we could. In order to have perfectly cut out windows and egg hutch holes, I went to the inside and drilled with a long drill bit so it'd go straight through and I'd get a very accurate punch through to the other side. You can see the chalk line to where the stud is. And then I went back to the outside and cut them all out with a jigsaw. Here I am now installing the egg hutch. So the two outer supports go on the inside of the studs attached to them, and then the two center supports sit flush. So they needed to be different dimensions, so I had to take that into consideration. Part of the consideration for the size of my egg hutch was the scrap pieces of plywood I had left over from cutting out the windows to not waste more sheet goods. And I did take the extra time to put down some vinyl flooring and put a bead of caulk around it, so in the event I need to hose the whole place out, that's an option to me. It was fairly tricky to bevel this top edge there so that the roof sheathing portion of the egg hutch would fit flush and make a nice firm seal so the 60-mile-an-hour winds didn't blow up in there and upset the chickens, which was a little bit more complicated, but not overwhelmingly difficult. There was a couple spots where I didn't anticipate the overlapping of some of the plywood in this section, but all in all it turned out all right. I followed the same procedure for the roof tiles and underlayment, except I didn't put the metal flashing because it would have been at a sharp angle by where we're unlatching and getting into the egg hutch, so I didn't worry too much about that. I've got about 1.5 feet of overhang, so it's actually underneath the overhang. I just put the roofing on for consistency and look and durability. We spent an extra $20 or so to put down some vinyl flooring. It looks fancier than it is. This was the lowest cost one they had at the home improvement store, and it makes it very easy to sweep out. I put a bead of caulk around it again in case I ever need to hose this thing out, I can. And we put a little edge there to keep the deep litter out of the egg laying boxes. And the chickens do seem to want to jump up onto a perch of sorts before getting into the egg laying hutch. This is our first set of chickens, so I wasn't really sure what they needed for a roost bar, and so I tried to account for 8 inches of deep litter and what the different hatcheries suggested and whatnot. So I built that just standard medium height perch, and within a couple days the birds were jumping to the very top, which was actually just my cross brace to support the walls. It wasn't intended to be a perch, but within a couple days the chickens were all the way up on the top, which was pretty funny. One of the funny things about this build is I made the supports for that roost bar going down because to me it felt stronger, and within 2.5 seconds of the chickens being in there they ran smack dab into it. So I don't know if they couldn't tell the difference of where it was because it's all white, but if I were to do this again I'd have the supports going up. They seem to have worked it out, but next chance I get with good weather I'm going to get in there and move them around and also add an additional roost bar. On the inside of my windows, I attached 1/4-inch hardware cloth with a staple gun, which is a complete pain in the butt. I tried using my air stapler, and that just tears up the hardware cloth. So on the outside of the build, I started switching to lath screws, which was way better. On the outside, I attached some acrylic plexiglass, if you will, so that I could throw up a window for the winter time, and then when it gets to be 110 degrees in the summer, I can pull them off and have full ventilation. Up in the top there is just hardware cloth with no window that's meant to be permanent ventilation year-round. I did spend the extra time and money to completely paint the inside surfaces because every chicken coop I've ever been in that's raw wood gets incredibly nasty, and the wood seems to soak in all the filth and flarn, and so I did prime it and I did paint it with a high quality paint so that, if I need to go in there and blow it off with an air gun or hose it down or sweep it off, I at least have that option to keep it clean and as sanitary as a chicken coop can be. I used a prefabricated GFI 4-gang box for simplicity, honestly. It was more expensive than wiring it up, but it was, winter was coming and the chickens were outgrowing the garage. So I threw this in. One thing I didn't think about is chickens peck everything. Luckily, the electrical box is so far up in the corner that they can't access it, but if it's anywhere they can access it, they are going to peck at it. But so far this is working well, and it's operating the no freeze water container. I set the floor of the chicken coop height to be equal to a wheelbarrow, so it's super easy to sweep out the deep litter method. And when installing the doors, I started with the bottom tailgate, if you will, so I had something to rest on when I started building the upper doors. For me, that worked out pretty well. The only thing I didn't factor in is the gate latches I put on the bottom tailgate get properly in the way of the top barn doors, and it all kind of binds up. And so I did have to move those down. So, measure thrice, cut twice. You know the deal. My wife and I are actually agricultural researchers for our job, and so I looked at the agricultural research for properly commercially raising layer hens when we decided our floor substrate. And I actually went with a combination of sand at the bottom. So I used a volume calculator to figure out how much sand it would take to fill the bottom with 1 inch, happened to be 2 cubic feet. Then on top of the sand, we put a combination of aragonite, zeolite stall refreshener, and then we used a combination of aspen shavings and straw with a 70% straw, 30% aspen shavings ratio. And so I sprinkled the aspen shavings down and then put straw on top of it, then did another layer of aspen shavings and then another layer of straw. And what that allows me to do is, as the chickens poop in concentrated places, it allows me to rake the straw, and so that the poop falls down onto the sand and dries out and then is combined properly with a high carbon resource in the aspen shavings. And then the straw gives them cushion and comfort to be able to jump down off of the perches. And they also seem just remarkably compelled to just scratch at the ground. And so I think this combination of sand, aspen shavings, and straw satisfies the natural desires of the chicken to scratch around and look for stuff, while allowing me to make it really easy to keep it a healthy, happy bottom. And so about once a week I go in there and stir it all around with a rake so that the manure is not concentrating in one location. So far, after a few months, that's working great. I finished off the interior with that black horse tub that's filled with a combination of high quality compost, aragonite, zeolite stall refreshener, and some lightweight sand that was dry so that they can dust bathe. I've got two, as they claim, spill-free feeders, which is horse crap. That stuff spills all over the place regardless. They're working all right through the winter. And then the little red cap here in the foreground is my no ice water container that I got at the local feed store. And it's actually working pretty good. I think it's about a 60 watt or something like that. And it's gotten down to 10 degrees, and the chickens are feeding just fine. I started them from day one on the nipple feeders, so they don't seem to be bothered by it at all. And as summer comes, I'll put a more traditional bowl. But for now, this is working pretty good. When attaching the outside run, I had my wife go on the inside and run the screws, and I gave her the wrong screws and came about a 1/4 inch from having the wife run a screw through the palm of my hand. So always, safety third. My wife comes from a family of artists and builders, and so the competition's pretty steep here in town to make nice, attractive building projects. So for some reason, I overcomplicated the chicken run, but I'm glad I did. It worked out really well. So what I did was I put them at about a 20-degree slope there, again, to save on building materials, to make it resistant to the wind. I figured the angle would be more resilient in the wind. And honestly, I'm new to the snow, so I wasn't sure how that was going to pan out. But the angled chicken run with the 1/4 inch wire works very well in the snow. And in the rain and the snow, and the chickens actually come up to it and drink water and snow that catches off of the 1/4 inch hardware cloth. So that worked out pretty well. It took a little bit of brain power to work it out, but it was well worth the effort. You just got to make sure that it's plumb level and square as you go. I threw a bunch of supports in there, and it's working fantastic. When spring comes, I'm going to add an extra 4 feet because the chickens actually like to run. I didn't even know that, but they seem to like to sprint, and I think they would really appreciate an extra distance to be able to run a little bit further. Predator proofing the run was actually fairly easy because the railroad ties were already in place and securely built. So all I had to do was attach my chicken run to those railroad ties, and then I only had to actually protect one front section by digging and burying, and so I feel it's extremely predator proof. I did an obsessive amount of pre-planning, but one thing I didn't even think about was how long my ramp was going to be to come down from this elevated platform. And the chickens hated it. I hated how much floor space it took up, so we ditched it. And I built this little first place, second place, third place podium, and the chickens love that. And I think it's pretty unique. Everybody wants to give the chickens a a ramp and then free feed them, and then they get obese. And once they get obese, it actually starts breaking the eggs or stops egg production. So based on my research, I think most of the reason why the chickens stop laying eggs is actually obesity. So they love jumping out of this thing like crazy maniacs. I think it's keeping them fit. It's giving them something to do. And it's a little bit hard to see in this image, but I did add the 1/4-inch hardware cloth around the bottom. And again, I sloped it down under the dirt and screwed it into the railroad ties. We have a solid 4 to 6 months of snow in winter, and I thought it was going to be of the utmost importance to have a place that was permanently dry for these chickens. And so underneath the hen house, I've got a full 8 foot of width darn near that's completely dry, and they absolutely love going under there to that dry dirt. They dust bath under there. They dig for nuggets. I'm really happy that I did that, and I think that's one of the most important components of this winter chicken build is having a perfectly dry place that they can go to. So I'm pretty happy about that. The little podium exit seems to be keeping them fit. They do get to fly a little bit and burn off some energy and some calories, and they seem to enjoy it. They come out like bonsai maniacs. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed our chicken coop, and we'll keep you updated in the future.